All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going way back in time, all the way to 1922. We've got some excerpts from a book called Life and Teachings of Tukaram.
Okay.
One of our lovely listeners sent this in, so we had to take a look. This book really gets into Tukaram, a major figure in Maratha religious tradition, right?
Oh, yeah, huge.
It gives us a glimpse into not just his life, but also the whole scene back then.
That's right, yeah. His teachings, how he saw society, the religious landscape of his time, the whole 9 yards.
That's also a cool story behind the book itself. It was started by this Professor James Nelson Fraser, but sadly, he didn't get to finish it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, somebody else picked up the torch and saw it through.
What a story.
Right.
Yeah.
So to kick things off, maybe you can give us some context. Where do we even begin with understanding Tukaram and his world?
Okay, so the first thing to grasp is the religious landscape he was a part of.
Okay.
Tukaram's life and teachings, they're really intertwined with the Vithoba tradition.
The Vithoba tradition.
This is a branch of Hinduism specifically focused on Vishnu, often seen in his Krishna form.
Gotcha.
Vithoba is like the central deity of the Bhakti movement in the Deccan region.
So Vithoba is the main player in this world.
Exactly. And there's been this huge outpouring of Marathi literature centered around him, going all the way back to the 13th century.
Wow.
And it wasn't just any writers. We're talking major poet saints.
Okay.
Names like Namdev, Eknath, Ramdas, all alongside Tukaram himself. They're still revered today. So you've got to understand, Tukaram's whole religious system, it's rooted in this Vaishnava tradition with its heavy emphasis on devotion to Vithoba.
Right. So we've got this Vithoba-centric world.
Right.
But one thing that really jumped out at me from the book was this comparison to Buddha.
Interesting, right.
Yeah, the foreword makes this connection. And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. It's a fascinating comparison. So to get that, we've got to touch on nirvana, the Buddhist concept.
Okay, nirvana.
Literally, it means extinction of self. But scholars explain it as getting rid of cravings, especially those connected to our desires and those negative emotions.
Like?
Lust, hatred, delusion, the big ones.
Extinguishing yourself in all those passions. Sounds pretty intense. How does Buddha say you get there?
Well, through contemplation that leads to, kind actions and compassion for every living being all the time.
Right.
He called it ahimsa, abstention from injury.
Right.
But he made it broader.
How so?
To cultivate goodwill, love, friendliness for everyone.
Gotcha.
And a big part of that, extinguishing those desires.
Okay, so passions are the obstacle.
Yeah.
But then the book brings in this contrasting view from the saints, Tukaram included, right?
Exactly. So they were totally on board with the ahimsa, the non-injury.
Yeah.
And ditching the caste system, that resonated. But they had this fundamental disagreement with, the body and its passions being the main enemy.
Interesting. So what were they saying?
Like, if our passions are our enemies, they're also what drive us, right? Isn't it through them, directed towards good, that we can achieve the good things Buddha was talking about?
Right, like benevolence and love.
Exactly.
So it's not about getting rid of them completely. It's about, changing their direction.
Exactly. So the drive, the motivation for those good thoughts and actions has to come from something higher, a higher self. They use this beautiful image of a river, starting from rainwater in the sea, nourishing fields, helping people, and eventually returning to the ocean.
Wow.
Similarly, our soul's within our body, and the goal is to redirect it back to its source, to God.
Okay.
So true nirvana, for them, isn't about ceasing to be. It's about achieving something else entirely.
So what is it?
It's peace, achieved through doing good, to everyone, even to those who've wronged you. And this peace is available to everyone regardless of social status.
That's pretty powerful.
And it happens by yoking the soul to the oversoul, God.
Okay, like connecting, merging with the divine.
Yes, surrendering to a higher power through love for him.
Okay, so channeling those passions towards good, guided by that connection, not just getting rid of them.
That's it.
Okay. That gives us a much clearer understanding of Tukaram's spiritual outlook. So let's zoom out a bit now and look at the context of India during his time.
Okay.
The book addresses some interesting assumptions and realities. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it tackles this common misconception in the West that the people of India lacked strength, determination,
Right.
It kind of shuts that down by pointing to things like the ancient pilgrimage routes.
Okay.
Worn deep into the hillsides by, countless people over centuries.
Wow.
And the sheer effort to carve these massive temples out of rock. back in the day.
Right?
Tangible proof of their resilience.
Yeah, that really challenges those sweeping generalizations, doesn't it?
It does.
What about the impact of poverty on religious practices? There's this proverb that stood out, Patoba first, then Vithoba.
Yeah, so Patoba first, then Vithoba, meaning belly first, then God. It really shows you the daily reality for many, right?
Right.
The constant struggle to put food on the table took priority over religious practices.
Makes sense. So what did the overall religious landscape look like? Who were the popular deities?
Well, based on the temple counts, Vishnu and Krishna were big, obviously.
Right.
Lots of temples dedicated to them. Shiva had a strong following too, especially with the Brahmins.
Oh,
And what's interesting is you also had a good number of shrines dedicated to, older indigenous gods.
oh, really?
Yeah, and to Devi.
Interesting.
And even a few Muslim dargahs were venerated.
So a pretty diverse scene, but the book also mentions superstition sticking around.
Yeah, that's right. Despite these major religions, superstitions were still very much a thing.
Like what?
Trying to appease evil spirits like Vitala, especially out in the rural areas. People would offer things like coconuts.
Coconuts?
Maybe symbolizing a human head? Who knows?
To pacify them.
Yeah, to try and ward off any trouble.
Interesting.
And during times of crisis, like epidemics, it would get even more intense.
Right.
They might even put up temporary images of the diseased spirit outside the village,
Oh, wow.
hoping it wouldn't come in.
That's fascinating. So even alongside established faiths, older beliefs held on. Now, switching gears a bit, the book mentions the Maratha period. What was their role in all of this?
So the Marathas, known for their military strength.
Yeah.
And for freeing the country from Mughal rule. It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
They didn't leave behind a lasting system, like a really inspiring one in terms of governing or societal vision. The book contrasts their authority, which was mostly military, with the high honor given to poets.
So military might versus artistic contribution. And it seems Marathi poetry still holds a special place today, right?
Absolutely. The book really highlights that. Abhangas, the devotional songs, and pausis, the religious texts, they're still part of every festival. Kids learn the poetic language in school, and there's a lot of scholarly work being done, like research, literary criticism.
So that rich cultural heritage is still alive and well.
Very much so.
Okay, let's move on to a bit of a complex topic.
Okay.
Tukaram and the caste system. The book talks about its presence, especially at Pandharpur.
Yeah, this is tricky. The caste system at Pandharpur, the center of Vithoba worship, it's complicated.
How so?
So you hear that Vithoba was accessible to all castes, right?
Right.
And that from the 13th to the 16th centuries, caste distinctions were kind of blurred inside the temple.
Right.
But the book throws in some conflicting information. It talks about this Mahar poet saint, Chakamila, 14th century. Tradition says he was banned from Vithoba's temple because he was an untouchable, an outcast.
That contradicts the idea of universal access. How does the book explain that?
Well, it clarifies the rule at Pandharpur. Low castes were allowed in, but outcasts, untouchables, were always excluded. Always. But it also emphasizes this democratizing influence of the Marathi Bhaktas.
Like Tukaram.
Yeah, which led to this surprising openness within the temple.
Okay.
Low caste devotees were allowed to embrace the deity, just like anyone else.
So inclusivity to a point, but a hard line for the outcasts.
Right. And the book points out how unfortunate it is that they were excluded. They could only worship Chokamela's image across the street.
Really highlights that tension between ideals and reality.
Yeah.
What about the actual practices at Pandharpur? What would a pilgrim experience there?
Well, the book describes a number of practices. One interesting one is women offering their hair.
Really?
Called Vetan Darshan, even if their husbands are alive, which, is similar to what Brahmin women do at Gaya.
Well,
But the main thing is Darshan, having a vision of the god.
right.
And what's unique at Vithoba's temple is touching his feet. It's considered a huge privilege.
Touching the feet. Wow, that's personal.
It is.
Were there different types of visits, ceremonially speaking?
Oh, yeah. The book outlines a few, like Dul Darshan. This is when a pilgrim arrives late, and they go straight to the temple, all dusty from their journey.
Showing their eagerness.
Exactly. But then there are more formal ones, like Mahapuja. This is where the pilgrim pours the 5 nectars over the image and maybe makes a valuable offering. But there have been issues with this, so now you usually need permission.
Gotcha.
Padya Puja is more common, washing the feet of the image, applying sandalwood paste and rice, offering a garland, incense, and a cash offering.
Wow.
Then the image is adorned with ornaments, they offer sweets, and then they go on to worship Rukmi, Vithoba's consort.
So a whole range of practices.
Yeah.
Now, to understand Tukaram better, we need to talk about his biographer, right?
Right.
Mahipati, the book mentions him quite a bit. Who was he?
Mahipati is the main guy when it comes to Tukaram's life story. He wrote several big works. His Santa Lilamrita and Bhakta Lilamrita. His main work on Tukaram was finished around 1762, 1763,
Okay.
well after Tukaram's death. So a lot of what we know about Tukaram comes from him.
But he wrote so long after Tukaram. What were his sources?
That's the tricky part. Figuring out his exact sources is tough.
Yeah.
But the book does point to a few known ones, the Abhangas, the poems, of Tukaram's brother, Kanahoba,
Okay.
and the Abhangas of Rameshwar, who was actually an enemy of Tukaram before becoming a disciple.
Wow.
Also the Gatha of Niloba, another disciple, likely sources.
Interesting.
And you have to consider, Mahipati lived much later, right?
Yeah.
He probably drew on oral traditions, stories passed down through generations.
Makes sense. So a mix of written and oral accounts shaped over time.
Right.
All right, let's get into Tukaram himself. The book outlines what it considers the probable facts about his life.
Okay.
Where did he come from? Who is his family?
So the story starts with this ancestor named Visvambara,
Visvambara, all right.
a trader in Dehu devoted to Vithoba, known for his honesty, generosity.
A good guy.
Yeah. He'd use his profits to host holy men and Brahmins on their pilgrimages, and he'd gather his neighbors to sing praises of Ram and Krishna.
Wow.
Following his mother's advice, he went on this pilgrimage to Pandharpur, and it really changed him.
Right.
He came back restless, constantly longing to go back.
Sounds like a powerful experience. What did he do?
So he went back to Pandharpur,
Okay.
and he expressed his deep yearning to be there. And it seems he heard a divine voice.
A divine voice. Wow.
Assuring him that God was everywhere.
Okay.
And would be present whenever he called upon his name.
Powerful.
Yeah. So Visvambara started making regular trips, like every 2 weeks.
Wow.
Then, after 9 months, he had this dream where Hari, either Vishnu or Shiva, tells him he's become his debtor and will come to stay with him.
Wow. What happened when he woke up?
Well, he installed an image near the Indrayani River. With the help of Brahmins, he performed a big ceremony, offerings, singing, the whole thing.
So a strong family history of devotion. What about Tukaram's parents and his birth?
So the lineage goes Vithoba, Padaji, Sankara, Kanhaya, and Bulhoba,
Okay.
also called Bulhaji. He was Tukaram's father. He spent 20 years on pilgrimages and religious stuff. Then he had 3 sons. For the birth of their second son, Tukaram, his mother, Kanakai, went to a secluded temple.
Okay.
And the book describes a radiant light on his face at birth and a sense of, peace and devotion.
Wow. A birth filled with auspicious signs. What about his later life? I know the book mentions some hardships.
Yeah, Tukaram's life was marked by a lot of suffering, famine, bankruptcy, and the loss of loved ones. His eldest son died, and then during a time of famine, his wife, Rakhmabai, died.
I know.
Crying out for bread, it's heartbreaking.
It is.
And these events, they really affected him. It made him question his pursuits, the fleeting pleasures. He decided to dedicate himself to Hari. There's this moment where he closes his eyes, calls upon the image of Pandurang,
Which is the Thoba.
right,
Yeah.
and stays in silent contemplation for 7 days.
7 days.
According to Mahipati, this is when he heard the divine voice.
Wow.
That solidified his path.
A turning point born from loss.
Yeah.
And his teachings often focus on detachment, right?
Exactly. His own tragedies, they shaped how he saw the world. It's all about seeking that lasting truth.
Powerful. The book also has some really interesting stories about his encounters and teachings. The story of the dishmuk and the coconut is so vivid.
Yeah, it really shows the difference between, skepticism and true faith.
How so?
So you have Deshpande, a Deshmukh, basically a local chief. He mocked Tukaram's teachings,
What?
refused a coconut Tukaram offered, thinking it was worthless.
Okay.
Then you have Khandoba, another Brahmin, humble, unlettered. He accepted that same coconut,
Yeah.
found valuable pearls inside worth a fortune. Really?
The story goes, those pearls were meant for the poet Saint Dineshwar,
Oh, okay.
but God redirected them to Tukaram, knowing he wouldn't refuse a simple offering. And get this, Khandoba, through his faith, is said to have been blessed with knowledge of Sanskrit.
So humility and faith are rewarded.
Exactly. What about his interactions with the religious establishment, like Rameshwar part?
Yeah, and that fakir, Anagadasha, tell us about those.
Okay, so Rameshwar Bhatt, he was a learned Brahmin, but he hated Vishnu worshippers. One day, he unknowingly went into this fakir's garden, Anagadasha, in Pune.
Okay.
And he bathed in a pool that was sacred to the fakir.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, Anagasha was furious.
Understandably.
He cursed Ramarash, saying his body would burn without any external flame.
Wow. Harsh.
And it's said that Rameshwar actually felt this internal burning.
Oh, wow.
People said it was the curse. But this and other experiences changed him. He became a disciple of Tukaram.
So Tukaram's influence reached even his opponents.
What about that incident where he threw his Abhangas in the river?
Oh, that's a dramatic one.
That must have been tough.
So Tukaram was facing opposition, maybe even persecution, for his teachings and his Abhangs because they were written in the common language, Prakrit, not the high-class Sanskrit.
Right.
He felt he had to throw his writings in the Indrayani River.
He did it himself.
Yeah, placed them between stones, wrapped them in cloth.
Wow.
With his poems gone, forbidden to write new ones, it must have felt like the end.
It would.
But after a time of silence, he miraculously started composing again.
Faith reaffirmed. So what did he actually teach? What kind of life did he advocate?
Well, a big thing was detachment from material things.
Okay.
And the constant pursuit of inner spiritual realization.
Right.
He talks about it in his Abhangs, saying things like torches, umbrellas, horses, they don't interest him, and questioning why anyone would get caught up in worldly stuff. He found happiness in simplicity, famously saying a rock was a good enough bed and the sky a good enough blanket.
Wow. He even said there's no greater happiness than a beggar's.
Really?
Free from all the material worries. And a central theme was this unity of all existence.
Seeing the divine in everything.
Yes.
And who are his followers? The book mentions his disciples.
Yeah, he had quite a following. We talked about Rameshwar Bhatt, the Brahmin, who was an enemy and then became a disciple.
Right.
His own brother, Kanahoba, was crucial. He took care of the family business, so Tukaram could focus on his spiritual work.
Wow.
Then there were others like Gangaram Avalva Kadelkaskar, a Brahmin, and Santaji Tili Jagannath.
Okay.
They served as his kirtankars, the ones who give the religious discourses and scribes.
So, a diverse group drawn to his teachings.
Very much so.
Now, the story of Tukaram's departure is something else, the ascension to Vaikuntha.
Yeah.
How does the book tell that?
So Mahipati tells like this. Hari himself says, let's go to Vaikuntha, which is the heavenly abode of Vishnu.
Okay.
Tukaram says goodbye to his wife, even invites her to come.
What did she say? She had practical reasons to stay.
All
She was
right.
pregnant, needed to care for the buffalo, the kids, you know.
Makes sense.
So the story ends with Tukaram literally ascending to heaven with Hari.
That's quite a dramatic exit. But the book also offers a more symbolic interpretation, right?
It does. It suggests those Abhangs about going to Vaikuntha are more like foreshadowing his death,
Okay.
not a literal ascension.
Right.
This fits with a Hindu tradition of carrying a deceased saint's body in a framework like a vimana, a celestial chariot.
Yeah.
So it's a metaphor for leaving the earthly realm.
I see. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Tukaram's writing style? What made his Abhangs so powerful?
Well, one thing is his use of metaphors. He got that from studying earlier poet saints like Jnaneshwar and Eknath.
Okay.
They were masters of metaphor in Marathi literature.
Right.
So he used existing metaphors, which was common, but he also created his own, really vivid and relatable ones.
So drawing from tradition and creating something new, what about the overall tone? What were the key themes?
While he was a deep thinker, grappling with big ideas, there's also this genuine humor in his work.
Really?
It challenges that whole Western idea that Hindus lack humor.
Right.
And he'd use imagery from a wide range of religious figures, even the more, shall we say, morally ambiguous ones,
Interesting. Why?
to create layers of meaning, adding depth and complexity to his verses.
So using unexpected figures to bring out spiritual truths. The book also mentions this debate about his Abhangs that mention pilots or peons.
Yeah, that's been a big discussion.
What's it about?
Some argue those Abhangs are all about focusing only on spiritual stuff,
Okay.
maybe even neglecting worldly duties.
Interesting.
And in a historical context, maybe even weakening the Maratha people,
How so?
diverting their attention from things like military strength.
I see.
But others say no, it's using the language of the everyday world, but the underlying meaning is spiritual.
Okay.
Like these figures, officials, messengers, they're just tools to convey deeper truths.
No, it's all about interpretation.
Right.
Now, the book also looks at Tukaram as a preacher.
Yeah.
How did he see himself in that role?
Well, he often expressed feeling unworthy.
Right.
He acknowledged his lack of formal education, but he definitely saw himself as a preacher with an important message.
A divine message.
Exactly. He believed God gave him the ability to communicate those truths even with his simple language.
Powerful.
And he was very against professional orators who charged for their curtains. He called them religious imposters.
Wow. Strong words.
He really believed in sincerity. Inner transformation was key.
So authenticity was paramount for him.
Yeah.
What about his view on idolatry?
That's a tricky one. He wasn't a big fan of just outward rituals and worshiping idols without real devotion.
Right.
But in his poems, he seems to suggest that God does manifest in images.
Okay.
He believed God consents to this form to help people connect with him.
Makes sense.
But he always stressed that it depends on the worshiper's faith.
So the power is in the belief, not the idol itself.
Exactly. He said, it was our faith that brought about your full incarnation. And the very essence is faith. Stones can become gods through sincere belief.
Powerful stuff. But the book also mentions some negative consequences of this.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. The book worries that many Hindus focused on the outward part, the idol worship.
And missed the deeper message.
Yeah, they neglected the inner purity, the devotion, the inner transformation that he really emphasized.
It's interesting how a message can be misinterpreted. What about Tukaram's view of Pandharpur? What made it so sacred to him?
For him, it wasn't just about the myths and legends.
Okay.
It was about Vishnu standing incarnate there because of Pundalika's devotion.
This humble devotee.
Right. He didn't really criticize the practices of Pandharpur, unless he thought they were, degrading or immoral.
Right.
But he was definitely against the religious fakers he saw there.
So the holiness of the place came from Vithoba's presence.
Right. Manifested through love.
What about his views on Brahmins? Did he have a consistent view?
It's hard to say. In some passages, he talks about reverence for them, supporting them, honoring sages and those dedicated to knowledge.
Right.
But then there are other parts where he criticizes Brahmins who don't live up to their duties.
So respecting the role, but being critical of individuals.
Yeah.
The book also talks about the Warkari sect. What's their connection to Tukaram?
So the Warkaris are the ones who do the pilgrimages to Pandharpur.
The varies.
Right. And what's cool about them is they're very egalitarian. Anyone can join.
Really?
Yeah. You accept a rosary made of basil beads and ochre banner and express your sincere wish. During initiation, they put the rosary on a copy of Gyaneshwar's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita.
Wow.
The main principles are visiting Pandarya, devotion to Vithoba, and simple living, often voluntary poverty.
Right.
Their sacred texts are the works of the 4 great Marathi Bhaktas.
Including Tukaram.
Of course. His Abhangas are super important to them.
So Tukaram's a key figure in this tradition. The book mentions this idea of pessimism in his teachings.
Yeah, some people focus on the poems where he talks about the world being unreal and wanting to escape its suffering.
Right.
This fits with the idea of renunciation in some Hindu thought.
Okay.
Some even try to put him in the Advaita philosophy camp.
Which says the world isn't real.
Right.
But the book says that's not the whole picture.
Yeah, there's more to his teachings than just that. He had a more nuanced view.
So it's important to look at the whole thing.
Right.
The book also brings up Tukaram's relevance to Christian missions in India.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
What does it say?
Some scholars believe that Tukaram and the poet Saint Tulsidas are the closest India gets to Christian truth.
Really?
And that studying his poetry is a good intro to Indian religious devotion for Christians. The book argues that understanding figures like Tukaram is key for creating unity in India.
Makes sense.
And for missionaries, it's important to understand the people's inner lives. Right.
Absolutely.
It stresses the need for sympathy and deep study.
Right.
And they see Tukaram as a prime example of individual religious life within Hinduism.
Interesting perspective. What about Tukaram's own inner life? The book talks about a mystical conflict.
Yeah, there's this theme of spiritual struggle in his poems.
Okay.
Doubt, longing, desolation. It seems it wasn't just in his early years, but something he experienced throughout his life. Even after those moments of spiritual insight, he still had doubts.
So even the great struggle.
They do, but the book argues that this conflict shows a kind of nobility.
In the struggle.
Yeah, he was aware of the mysteries of the universe, but he found solace in being with God.
Powerful. And the book ends by highlighting his enduring appeal.
Yeah, across cultures and time, it argues that the truths in his Abhangs are still relevant today.
Makes sense. They deal with universal human experiences.
Exactly. And there's a quote from Sir Alexander Grant, who compared Tukaram's songs to the Psalms of David,
Wow,
both expressing this constant communion with the divine.
that's high praise.